Hello and welcome. My name is Scott Harrison and I am a Senior Program Manager at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, a not-for-profit organization focused on Canada-Asia relations. I'm also a research fellow at Simon Fraser University's David Lamb Center. I thank both of these organizations for making this session possible today. So I'm airing from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. Part of these lands is also known as Vancouver, a city on the west coast of Canada in the province of British Columbia. Hope that making such a territorial acknowledgement will help raise some curiosity for our viewers, regardless of where you may be, and take it upon yourselves to take a closer look at the history and contemporary situation of this part of Indigenous Canada, and also reflect on what a territorial acknowledgement and reconciliation might mean and look like in the places where you work, live, play, and call home. In Canada, June is National Indigenous History Month, and today, June 21st, is National Indigenous Peoples Day, which makes our session with Dr. Kaneko Uzawa that much more special. I'd like to just provide a few housekeeping notes for our session today. Please note that our session is being recorded. We have both the chat feature and the Q&A feature enabled, and we welcome your comments and questions throughout. We're going to aim to get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. But if we don't have time to get to your question, or if you have a follow-up question later on, we welcome you to contact us directly afterwards. It should not need to be said, but please keep comments and questions respectful. Also, to make this feel as personable as possible, it would be a pleasure if the attendees would entertain us by entering in the chat feature where you're coming from, introduce yourself, and say hello. To help us navigate the questions during the Q&A session, as well as to provide a short commentary after Dr. Uzawa's talk, we're delighted to have Cheyenne Connell on the webinar with us as well. Cheyenne is Duneza and Cree from West Moberly First Nation in BC and is currently a master's student in cultural anthropology at Simon Fraser University. She's just finishing up her thesis, which explores Ainu identity making and community belonging in North America and online. Starting in the fall, she's going to move over to University of British Columbia and start a PhD where she's going to continue this work, focusing on how global and local expectations of indigeneity shape Ainu identity making in Japan. So thank you, Cheyenne. So I'm also delighted to be moderating the session today and to welcome Dr. Kaneko Uzawa to speak to us today about what does it mean to be Ainu in the 21st century, Ainu authenticity. Dr. Uzawa obtained a master's degree in Indigenous Studies and a doctorate in Community Planning and Cultural Understanding at the UiT Arctic University of Norway. She held an internship in the project to promote ILO policy and Indigenous and tribal peoples at the International Labour Organization in Geneva, and she is currently an affiliated research at the Research Faculty of Media and Communications at Hokkaido University, Japan. Dr. Uzawa contributes to collaborative research and Ainu performing art on the multifaceted articulations of Indigenous knowledge. So Dr. Uzawa will be giving a 30 to 40 minute presentation. And after that, we're going to take a 5-minute break before we proceed with a few minutes of comments and then open up to audience questions. So Dr. Uzawa, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Iran Kalapte. This is a Ainu greeting. Iran Kalapte means hello, but also it's a different meaning depending on who translates this, but can also mean that let me touch your heart. Thank you for this invitation. I am honored to be here today, and congratulations for this Canada Indigenous Day. I'm so happy to be here. So now I would like to play recorded lecture for about 40 minutes, and then after that I'm excited to go further with questions and comment and feedback. Iran karapte, konnichiwa. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here today with you. I first like to send my warm thank you to the David Lam Center and all organizers who made this event possible today. I wish to pay my respect to the traditional owners of this land upon which I'm about to speak. I wish to celebrate this special Canada Indigenous Day by telling my stories as an advocate, performer, scholar, and mother. My name is Kanako Uzawa. My family originally comes from the Nibutani community, which is one of the Ainu communities in Hokkaido. I recently completed my doctorate degree at Arctic University of Norway in 2020. Here, one may wonder why I travel so far north for my education. My real first encounter with Norway goes back to the year 2000, when I visited Norway as a part of Ainu Sami culture exchange program. I was simply inspired by nature around here and the political establishment of Norwegian Sami. I was so inspired that I thought I could learn something from the Sami and share that knowledge with Ainu and Japanese society. As many of you probably know already, the Ainu have been targeted as fascinating research object in the late 19th century to even the mid-20th century. Many images one can see in Ainu literature, museums may give the impression that Ainu people and culture do not exist anymore and that Ainu culture belongs to ancient history. This is not true. I am an example of that, and we show how lively Ainu culture and people still exist and how we develop our culture even today. This is one of the reasons I pursue higher education, to explore new possibilities of presenting Ainu in academia and to the general public. I hope this is to be something to shed a new light on Ainu studies and contemporary livelihood of Ainu. Nearly 30 years ago, I first visited British Columbia on a cultural exchange program led by the first Ainu parliamentarian Shigeru Kayano, who is also my distant relative. We traveled to Alert Bay and met Dr. Gloria Cranmer-Webster and was so impressed how proudly Kwakwa youth, I hope I said it right, carry their culture and identity. This was a formative experience that led me on a path to become a committed Ainu rights advocate, scholar, and performer. My experience in Canada has stayed within me and provided a source of inspiration all these years. I am therefore grateful for this opportunity to speak and share my stories today. So let us talk about who we are, and then I would like to talk a little bit about myself and also move on to the case study in my dissertation, Udeshiba Club. And this is about the Ainu and Japanese students. I find it important to share this experience with you, and then I will move on to our ongoing project, website project, and the production of dance performance. So who are Ainu? Ainu means human being in the Ainu language. Ainu have traditionally lived in northern Japan and Russia with rich natural resources. There were Ainu who lived in Sakhalin, Cleveland Islands, who are also forcefully relocated to mainland Hokkaido after World War II. Here I heard a story that they faced a tremendous struggle when they relocate themselves to mainland Hokkaido. They spoke they had a different dialect and slightly different dialect from the mainland Ainu dialect. Also faced some discrimination. So to start life in Hokkaido was quite difficult. That's what I heard. So we are people hunting, fishing, and foraging wild plants and herbs, but also people who engaged in trade. The contact through trade between Wajin as ethnic Japanese and Ainu goes back to 14th century. Estimated population, this is a survey conducted 8 times in the past, and the most recent one is the one in 2017. The estimated population states 13,118 individuals in Hokkaido, and this is a government survey. However, Japan does not collect data on ethnicity in the national census, so the ethnic makeup of Japan is in fact unclear. Criteria, though, used for this survey are those who identify themselves as Ainu. This is subjective criteria, and those who are to believe to have Ainu bloodline, and then those who are married and adopted into Ainu families. Hokkaido consists 20% of Japanese territories. Historical sociologist, Professor Eiji Oguma at Keio University in Tokyo describes that due to its geographical location, current central government policy towards Ainu in the modern period was tied to Japan and Russian diplomatic relations. Hokkaido was considered as a disputed territory between Russia and Japan, while Ainu were considered neither a military threat nor economically relevant to Japanese government due to Hokkaido's low population. In 1899, Ainu were legally categorized by the Japanese government as a former Aborigines under the Hokkaido Former Aborigine Protection Act. Ainu homeland Hokkaido became part of Japanese colonization strategy. The concept of empty land was also used to justify the claiming of territory. Professor Oguma gives an interesting analysis describing that the purpose of colonization and assimilation of Ainu were not to reform the Ainu, but rather to possess Ainu land as Japanese territory in order to create the defensive border towards the west. Based on the belief that sending a greater number of Wajin is ethnic Japanese, to Hokkaido would eventually achieve the goal of colonization rather than focusing on Japanizing the Ainu. Surprisingly, the Hokkaido Former Aboriginal Protection Act remained until 1997 and finally replaced with Ainu Cultural Promotion Act, known as CPA. The CPA received much criticism at the grassroots level because it did not support or strengthen the independence of Ainu nor the livelihood of Ainu as indigenous people of Japan. For example, it was clear to these critics that the subject of the CPA was Ainu culture and not Ainu indigenous rights. And then the definition of Ainu culture being employed was also limited to one particular version of Ainu culture, traditional as authentic. Colonization assimilation policy had had a great impact on Ainu society, leading to many economic and social struggles, none of which were addressed in the CPA. In 2007, after tremendous work by the Ainu delegation at the UN Fora, which began, by the way, in 1987, Japanese government voted in favor of United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Over 144 countries have voted in favor of this declaration, and Japan was one of them. It's important to point out that the Japanese government at this point in 2007 had refused to recognize the Ainu as indigenous people of Japan according to the standard of international law. In 2008, however, Japanese government adopted resolution to recognize Ainu as indigenous people of Japan, making a reference to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Interestingly, this was interesting timing that Japanese government recognized Ainu as indigenous people right before the G8 summit. which was held in Hokkaido. 10 years later, 2018, we marked 150th anniversary of remaining ezochi to Hokkaido by Japanese explorer Takeshiro Matsuura. This celebration was heavily criticized by local Ainu, stating that one cannot celebrate this date without official apology from the Japanese government. Since April 2019, Ainu are for the first time in history written as indigenous people of Japan in Japanese legislation. However, it falls short of recognizing the rights of indigenous people as enshrined in the UN DRIP, such as self-determination and collective rights. Also, the term Ainu as indigenous peoples is not clearly explained in the legislation. Ainu language. Ainu language is a spoken language. What is special about it is that we have a rich oral literature. What happens when we only have a spoken language? We become very good at remembering things. I heard a story that Ainu used to remember names of all our relatives through the generations, sometimes even 100 to 200 years into the past. Collective memory, maybe this is what it's called in Aborigines Australia, right? So this is interesting comparison between Aborigines and Ainu. As another example of the wealth of our oral tradition, we have Kamui Yukara, Ainu saga told by and from perspectives of Kamui, our Ainu gods. In Ainu culture, gods imply nature, plants, and animal, and even sickness. These Kamui Yukara thus reflects how human livelihood are perceived by Kamui, and then often include important lessons for humans to learn how to coexist with nature around us. Ainu food culture. If you ever travel to Tokyo, please try Ainu restaurant, Haruko Ainu restaurant in Tokyo, where you can experience that Ainu food culture. Salmon is considered as one of the most important staple food. Shitatap is the dish made out of salmon heads, which is flavored with salt and green onion. We chop with a knife and put it on top of rice. Ohau is a soup. Chep ohau means salmon. Salmon ohau is a fish soup cooked together with vegetable, and the most commonly used dish in this ohau dish is salmon. The heads and bones are used as bouillon. And chiporodon is a rice bowl dish topped with salmon eggs, and then salmon fillet, this you know, and luibe is a frozen sashimi. And salmon skin is dried and sold for a certain period of time, and it's very tasty with sake and beer. All of these cooking techniques show how Ainu culture and philosophy behind it, which is to respect all the food given to the Ainu by not wasting any items. This is kitopiro, puksa in Ainu language. This is a green edible plant which can be found in the mountain of Hokkaido. It's commonly used in Ainu cooking. It looks similar to shinsen. It's in the Japanese plant, and which is poisonous. So every year some people die because they make a mistake picking those two, kitopiro and suisen. So kitopiro has distinct garlic flavor, which makes the acquired taste, and it's so notorious for its enduring aftertaste that local in Hokkaido recommend not to eat before important date. The foraging wild plants and herbs is an important part of Ainu culture, especially for women. The activity offers an important way for us to transfer traditional knowledge across generations. This is done by talking about what is the best way to cook the wild plants and herbs and stories behind it. Now, please allow me to share some of my personal stories here. So I was born in Tomakomai as a Nibutani community where my mother comes from. There's no big hospital. So I was born in Tomakomai, and but I consider Nibutani community as my home community as well as Tokyo. I grew up in different places, but mainly in Kanto and Tokyo area, and I spent some time in Fukushima prefecture and also Nibutani community. I marked here, and in Nibutani I met many researchers, foreign to Japanese researchers, journalists, all kinds of people coming in to do a research, interview Ainu people. And sometimes I even helped them because I spoke a little English then. And I came to, I never thought of myself becoming a researcher or anything like that. But I came to wonder what they are doing. I could not see the result and how those two results, research and its result, there seems to be a big gap. And as I grew up, I realized that, in fact, Ainu voices are not really represented in the literature, very little. And I find it quite frustrating, and it kind of triggered my curiosity and wanted to find out. And even more when I start taking higher education, start wondering if I could make some changes in that perspective. So this is why I came to think about what does it mean to be Ainu in the 21st century? And what is Ainu authenticity? As one of source of inspiration is this Ainu restaurant, which is now closed down, unfortunately. It used to be urban hub in Tokyo where people gather up and eat and dance and sang. This is operated and run by Ainu Association of RELA, which is a cultural organization that disseminates Ainu culture and language. I am technically I'm still a member of this Ainu Association or Ainu Association RELA. And this is also how I learned Ainu dance and songs from elders in Tokyo, as I was also working at this restaurant as a university student then. Another source of inspiration is Nibutani community, where I met all most kindest people, and even though I wasn't living there permanently, locals always welcomed me. And I, of course, had the grandparents and cousins and uncle and aunt that I spent, I love to spend my time with. And this is the Ainu house you see in this picture, in the slide. Ainu housing is made out of thatch reed, and thatch usually refers to bambooed reed. House frame is tree, but the roof and wall are made from the thatches. A sacred window is facing east in this region. It depends on which region it is. So being far away from Japan, what I cherish most is the gift I received from Ainu elders and friends. And that is Ainu songs and dances, and that has been source of my inspiration. A upopo Ainu song that I'm going to play now is and represent everyday life, our everyday life, and in relation to nature and God and animal. And Ainu cosmology is that human and supernatural world exist mutually, while the Ainu lyrics of Ainu women's song may be nonsensical from the perspectives of the Western logic, but they reflect and provide important insight into Ainu everyday life. And as I say, it's a relation to nature and God and animal. So here I'm singing in the Ainu language. It's all played and sung by me. With the help of sound technician, I put it together. Now I'd like to move on to my case study in my dissertation. Here I tried to bring in Ainu voices in academic world. I do not have so much time left, so I would like to quickly move to next slide here. So Udeshiba Club was fascinating for me as Udeshiba Club specifically trains Ainu and Wajin youth to learn the Ainu culture and language within the university system. Udeshiba Club, Udeshiba means growing together, by the way, and Udeshiba Club was also the first quota system in Japan established in 2010 by Professor Yuko Honda. Here I ask the question, how does urban space because this was located in Sapporo City, how does the urban space provide challenges and opportunities to the expression of Ainu indigeneity in contemporary Japanese society? This is a question that I also asked myself when I was younger. Here, please allow me to show you or share some of the findings in this research. When I conducted field work in 2016, there were 20 students, Ureshiba students. Half of them identify themselves as Ainu and half of them identify themselves as Wajin students. What I found out was that Ainu cultural revitalization goes beyond the boundary between Ainu and Wajin relations. So it was very powerful to have a group organized activity where they are treated exactly the same and then practice. They had a study group and the performing art practice 2 times a week from 6 to 8:30 after school. And they take this activity and study very seriously. These are really fantastic students and devoted to their activities and goal. And some of them came to identify themselves Ainu, some of them came to identify more or less as Japanese, or it depends on the person to person, but they both found the cultural and social gap among themselves. And through this activity, they go through a personal journey of transformation. And then by that, it increases the effect of mutual respect. Many of the Japanese students say that they really appreciate this opportunity because they came to think about their own culture and language and what it means to be Japanese. Another thing was that geographical location do not limit possibilities of Ainu for cultural revitalization. Since this was located on the Sapporo University campus, unlike my case, even though I lived in Tokyo, I had elders with me when I learned Ainu dance and performance, but they did not. They have to travel to the community to have a guidance. So what they do is that they use internet video, old recording, and trying to learn from those materials. It is important for them to have fun and to be together and share such experience and then get recognition. This is more inclusive social model, and that increases, as I say, effect of mutual understanding. And that it goes beyond the pre-existing state-based and institutionalized social model. By that, Ureshiba actually contributes to our decolonization process. So this was my conclusion. One of my current projects is to create a website called Ainu Today, and this is the first English knowledge sharing platform for our international audience to learn more about contemporary Ainu voices, issues, and art. And this is supported throughout Ainu community members and like-minded friends and colleagues. Ainu Today celebrates and contributes to highlight for information about living Ainu and promotes forward thinking. I came to think about to create something like this, and I have been thinking for some years now that we actually don't have a digital platform where we can find information about contemporary livelihood of Ainu, not easily. So I wanted to create something accessible for anybody who's interested in Ainu culture and people. So here's our website, Ainu Today, and we have 3 sections: scholarship, arts, and advocacy. Let me introduce my lovely team members. Sebra is a PhD student at the University of California. And Scott, she does research on contemporary Ainu, and Dr. Scott is a senior program manager at the Asian Pacific Foundation of Canada, and who is today is also moderator. And Michael is also a PhD student at the University of California. And then Maria, who I met in Japan 2016, she helped me to design the website. So scholarship, for example, Mike and Sebra helped me tremendously to register all the literature. We are still working on the literature, so it's still work in progress. But for example, it's listed like this and categorized by themes. And then we have art. I'm an artist, including myself, and interviewed by Oki Kano, who is an Ainu musician, and Yoko Toyokawa, a singer, and Ainu designers, and etc. And then we go to advocacy. Here, I wanted to contribute the discussion of Ainu indigenous rights, which is less discussed in Japan internationally and little information available. And with the help of Shimin Gaiko Center, this is NGO located in Tokyo, I managed to include their activity, which is news, and their work on the Ryukyu people and Ainu people and concerning United Nations activities. What's exciting is that I included Ainu language class information and also Shito channel, which is a YouTube channel run by and created by an Ainu university student, Maya Sekine. And she has this short 3-4 minutes language culture program. So you click here and most of them are Japanese though, but then she teaches Ainu language. And this one is English subtitle. If you like to get in touch with us, please go to contact. And then here you are able to write us a message. Now, I like to conclude my lecture with this slide. And I like to say that what I'm trying to do through my research and project is to go beyond essentialized representation of Ainu people and culture. What seems to be a case is that Ainu people and culture have been viewed in a certain way, tradition as authentic. So I'm trying to break the pattern and the trend of the past by creating something new, more communicative and accessible. I use the term Ainupuri, which is traditionally explained and understood among Ainu as act of doing and practicing Ainu traditional ways. I use the term Ainupuri to denote Ainu ways of being or doing. I view Ainupuri as referring to indigeneity and connoting self-determination and the ability to decide how one wishes to express one's being and experiences without external interference. This understanding of Ainupuri allows us, living throughout Japan and overseas, to free ourselves from essentialized representation of what it means to be Ainu. Now I like to play dance video that I produced together with my musician friend. So the dance is it's a little bit of a contemporary dance and a mixture of contemporary dance and Ainu dance steps. Music is new. It's inspired by Ainu traditional song and instrument. I'd like to thank you so much for today's opportunity once again, and iairakere.
Thank you, Dr. Uzawa, for that illuminating, incredibly wide-ranging and personal presentation. We're now going to take a 5-minute break. So while we're away, please feel free to continue to use the chat feature to connect with us and with each other and submit any further questions in the Q&A function. And we'll be back in 5 minutes. And so see you in a few minutes. Thank you. Wonderful. Welcome back. So next I would like to invite Dr. Uzawa and Cheyenne Connell to join us on the screen, please. And we'll invite Cheyenne to say a few short comments. So Cheyenne, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you. So first, thank you so much again for the wonderful presentation. It was amazing, and I loved seeing the dance, especially at the end. And thank you, Scott, for organizing this event. I'm really privileged to be a part of this. I think this presentation and this conversation of Ainu authenticity is very important and timely, especially in terms of a bit more broadly Indigenous authenticity. This ongoing effort to interrogate and reimagine what being Ainu looks like in the 21st century is, as you said, often overlooked in a fair amount of scholarship. Often when we read about Ainu in Japan, we see scholars emphasizing these important yet historically rooted revitalization initiatives of Ainu and Ainu-ness. For example, things like embroidery and traditional dance are something I come across quite often. What we don't often see are the many ways in which Ainu are revitalizing their culture and traditions through different creative avenues, such as contemporary dance or high fashion, for example. Though these avenues are seen as perhaps a bit beyond typical traditional expressions, even from just watching a performance at the end, we can really see that these unique enactments of indigeneity are both of and beyond traditional expressions, that they too are still ancestrally rooted and connected. And I think what you're saying also goes beyond Japan. As an Indigenous researcher myself, I feel that these conversations, especially perhaps being more critical of scholarship, is vital to how academics, public, and even ourselves as Indigenous people understand and relate to Indigenous being. Growing up off reserve and away from my Indigenous side of the family, I was greatly limited to understanding and connecting to my own Indigenous community and culture. Even though I've since reconnected, as someone who didn't grow up with those things and has somewhat different avenues of self-expression, it's been a long and hard journey to try and bridge the gap between what I feel is expected of me as an Indigenous person and how I am today. Similar to Ainu, a lot of scholarship and media keep reproducing this image of the Indigenous person as very traditional, mirroring quite historical depictions of what being Indigenous looks and feels like. But like many of my Indigenous peers, it's just not representative of their experience and their being Indigenous. Yet, what is really great to see in your presentation again is that being Indigenous is clearly a much more multifaceted than this one, in a way, fossilized depiction. You know, we don't just cease to be Indigenous when we partake in things outside of our ancestral traditions. So long as we honor, respect, and embody the teachings of our elders and our ancestors, there are arguably a lot more ways we can express ourselves. Similarly, and I think you brought this up in our own conversations the other day, as well as your dissertation, is that you were inspired by Maori scholars. I think that is something not adequately represented in scholarship as well, is just how much Ainu and other Indigenous groups around the world are inspired by each other, as well as look to each other for ideas, understanding, empowerment, community, and belonging. For example, that being Ainu, while unique, can and does speak to other Indigenous peoples' experiences of being systematically disadvantaged by varying authorities. As such, there's also an important and long history of Ainu traveling outside of Japan to meet with and culturally connect with other Indigenous peoples. This includes, but is not limited to trips like in the 1970s, Ainu delegations going to Maori, China, to learn of cultural initiatives for ethnic minorities, as well as in 1989, Ainu sculptor coming to Burnaby, British Columbia, to create the sculptures that are in the second slide at the beginning of this seminar. And then as well as you mentioned, Ainu students who traveled to Maori, New Zealand only a couple years ago, I believe. In this way, Ainu have been long globally connected and have been informed by, as well as helped shape other Indigenous groups' experiences and understanding of indigeneity. This issue where it's often overlooked, I feel like it has a lot to do with the way scholarship and other knowledges are written about and disseminated publicly. First, I believe there is a good handful of English published scholarship that has yet to be translated to Japanese for Ainu members. This is something I personally struggle with my own research, is that since I am a novice to Japanese and I can't quite read it, there are a lot of Ainu voices that I end up neglecting in my own research. And though I am committed to bettering my Japanese and doing better for my PhD, it's a big shortcoming in my research that I feel is really important to recognize. Second, and closely related to that, is that a lot of Ainu and scholarship and general discourse in it, Ainu voices are rarely heard. That is not to say their experiences are neglected. They're often the center of the research, but rather they are not always meaningfully represented. They're talked about, described, and analyzed, but their voices and what they say themselves is not always put to paper. This is also an issue I see in Indigenous scholarship around the world, and especially in Canada, that we may frequently be talked about, but we don't get to do the talking ourselves and represent ourselves. Similarly, even when we do have access to, say, a dissertation or an article, many Indigenous folks aren't privy to academic language, nor can they make much meaning from convoluted papers. So these writings end up being completely inaccessible. As scholars and just general members of society that have arguably, a lot of us have profited off the genocide and systematic disadvantaging of Indigenous peoples. And even as an Indigenous person myself in academia, I think we can do better. And if we are working with Indigenous folks, our work first and foremost should be for the Indigenous people we work with. So I feel like we really need to use our powers to push for work for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. So that's why it makes me so excited to have read your dissertation and to hear more of your work and knowing that you're doing all these amazing things moving forward. In general, I think no one can really contribute to meaningful reconciliation if they're not doing their part. And so I really hope to see a lot more peoples and scholars really elevate Indigenous voices, especially Ainu voices, as well as making sure they're actually heard, so sharing them with others. That's pretty much it. I'm really excited to have this more representation for Indigenous people, especially Ainu folks. And I'm really excited, and like just with my own research, I know that a lot of young Ainu folks are really looking for more representation, that they can see themselves in the way people express being Indigenous. So I think a lot of young Ainu people that are just learning what it means to be Indigenous are really going to benefit from the work you do. So thank you again, and I'll pass it back to Scott.
Thank you, Shine, for your comments and for participating in today's session as well. It's greatly appreciated, and I hope Dr. Uzawa will have a chance to respond to some of your comments later today, if not in the coming weeks and months. So thank you again. So I'd also like to offer a few comments before we open up to audience Q&A. So Dr. Uzawa, your presentation was incredibly wide-ranging. Covered all sorts of issues and topics and themes. So I'll keep my comments and questions, I guess, limited to a few specific points that you mentioned along the way. So one, you mentioned the 150th anniversary of the renaming of Hokkaido from Ezochi. And this was a topic that, as you mentioned, saw a lot of frustration among the community in Japan, but also got attention here in Canada. For example, as you're aware of, the University of British Columbia held a 2-day session on Hokkaido 150 in March 2019. And over 500 people attended the events, including presentations on a variety of historical and contemporary issues, as well as performance by Ainu musicians. As one of the attendees, one of the things that struck me at this was that I noticed that issues were much more openly discussed than is typical in Japan, with a receptive audience, as well as a supportive university. And the support went all the way up to the president of the university. So here I wonder what your thoughts are on expressing and discussing issues in Japan versus abroad. And at the timing of Hokkaido 150 is also interesting when we think about it in relation to Canada. So Canada's 150th anniversary was in 2017. And there was a lot of discussion at that time and continuing what the last 150 years had meant for Indigenous peoples in Canada, as well as Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in the country. And one of the things, certainly not the only thing, lots of things came out of these discussions, but one thing that came out was the hashtag Canada150+, where the plus is playing a significant role here in our understanding of history and contemporary situations. When I looked for similar discussions or movements in Japan, I didn't really see it, despite the overlap and potential connections here. So one of the things I did is I did start a Hokkaido 150+ hashtag, but it didn't really go anywhere, speaking in large part to my inadequacies in social media. But I think this idea of Hokkaido 150+, and Hokkaido 150, Canada 150+, there's important parallels here that deserve continued and further discussion. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that either today or later on. You also mentioned another connection to Canada, a personal connection, via Kayano Shigeru's planned trips to the west coast of Canada for his language students. And this is personally interesting, as it's something I've been following for some time now, and it highlights the very important international aspect of indigeneity and indigenism, which Cheyenne was also mentioning in her comments. Yet in the literature, it's rarely mentioned, or if so, delegated to a few sentences here or there. And by the literature, I'm not talking about the global internationalism, I'm specifically talking about this Ainu global connection, especially to Canada. And I've been long, but very slowly, studying and learning about Ainu-Canada connections, including a trip by the Utari Association of Hokkaido, now the Ainu Association of Hokkaido in 1978, as well as Kayano-san's efforts to take his language students abroad, mainly to West Coast of Canada in 86, 93, and 1997, which we were a part of these, as well as other trips by artists such as Sunozawa Biki and Toko Nobudi in the 80s and 90s, a youth trip to Nunavut in 1999, other trips in 2001 to the West Coast, and the like. Could go on. I'll stop there. but also how such trips also built networks. These Ainu delegations or trips to Canada also helped build networks. So when Ainu began organizing large international events since the late 1980s, that they were well attended by Indigenous people in Canada, notably by the Kwakwaka'wakw on Alert Bay and Heiltsuk First Nations. So here I'm hoping we can further discuss how these and other trips and exchanges helped build international connections and how that has and continues to translate not just into academic literature, but changes in perceptions, programs, and policies. Further discussion about such trips and connections leaves also open possibilities for future collaborations and exchanges. A third point I'd like to mention is you briefly touched on the forced relocation of Ainu from Sakhalin and the Kurils after World War II. And this is another area that deserves significantly more attention than it does either in the media or in academic literature. Over the years, I've heard stories and read about how it's possible that not all Ainu from these places were forcefully relocated to Hokkaido, that a number remained in the Northern Kurils and Sakhalin. But given the sensitivities around border issues in this part of the host region, and that the issues cross international borders, or depending on your interpretation, areas of administration, and that dialogue takes place in both Japanese and Russian, such issues don't seem to get as much attention as they deserve. On food, food is something that unites us all, I think. I'd simply like to add that I had the pleasure of eating at both Leather Chisei and at Hadokor. And like Dr. Uzawa says, Hadokor is still open, and I'd highly recommend it for anyone who's visiting Tokyo to make a trip there when travel becomes possible again. And as someone who spent quite a bit of time over the years in Hokkaido, I'm also a fan of Kitokiro, and would also highly recommend for people to try it if you haven't done so yet. Another point of your talk, you mentioned how a driving force that fit into your personal experiences and your own international experiences in pursuit of graduate studies was also seeing how academic research did not often come back to the community. And Shine touched on this as well. And this is a incredibly important aspect. It continues to be not only here in Canada, around the world, but particularly among people that work with Ainu. So here I think it might be worth saying a few words about ethical research and what needs to be done to be making sure that everyone is doing work with rather than for or at Ainu. And your discussion of Ullespa, which you dive into in significantly more detail in your dissertation as a site of reconciliation and decolonization, is an incredibly timely one for what is happening in both Japan and Canada. So here I wonder what other initiatives like this could be done in Japan, Canada, or elsewhere to help promote and support reconciliation, decolonization, and what that means. My last point is on the topic of authenticity. It's in the title of your talk, and you talked about it in your own work as a performing artist, as well as a researcher. But it also plays into identity, as which you touched on. Here in Canada, this is also a big issue. I'll just highlight one in particular is in the tourism sector in Canada. So this is something that the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada and many other individuals and organizations have been doing a lot of work on over the years, specifically because many of the items that are sold in the tourism industry here in Canada are mass-produced overseas and do little benefit for local communities. So I know there's a lot of work being done to help mitigate this and make sure that we can distinguish, and tourists and regular people in Canada can help distinguish what maybe is mass-produced overseas versus created locally or with support with the local community and local artists. So there's so many more points we could add on here, but I'm going to stop there because I would like to open up to questions from the audience. So Cheyenne, maybe you could take it over. I'll pass it back to here to you. Thank you.
Yes, there are a lot of questions. So the first question then would be, let me see. Right. So as someone who is inspired by Maori scholarship and living in Norway, do you see similarities between Maori, Ainu, and Sami? And are there more exchanges that were done? So do you see these three indigenous groups connecting and shaping each other's indigenous experience?
Yes, I definitely think it does within academia and also probably art scene as well. Is that what I have been doing is to attend this conference, international conference, NISA, Native American Indigenous Association, I think. And that I have been attending in the last almost every year. And that has been amazing opportunity for me to meet scholars from all over the world and then to be inspired. And like I said, where I also met many Maori scholars. So because I'm located in Scandinavia, I traveled together with Sami delegates. And then I became part of their teams, and where I also learn things. And then of course, I meet Japanese academics there, or North America, everybody who work within Indigenous studies gather up and discuss. So this has been a big global platform for academia to gather up and shape and contemplate our thought further. So that has been incredibly helpful for me.
Great, thank you. Another question is, someone mentioned that you said, I think that means salmon, but then they have a book that says it actually means fish, so not particularly salmon. But on that note, do you see a lot of discrepancies or misinformation by Wajin and non-Ainu scholars?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, chep means salmon. So I happened to see the question, so I was a bit surprised to see that. Yeah, so that's all I can say about that. And then, so you ask an interesting question, how the documentation has been produced in the past decades is a big question. What is, again, authentic and truth? How close that is to how we know the knowledge that we think our knowledge, because as it was a written language, all the documentation that has been produced in the past, of course it's not everything. I haven't read every single literature, so this is just my own personal impression as well, is that some of the documentation are formed and written from the Wajin perspective or foreign perspective, and they may not have understand our worldview. And they go around in the community, interview the locals and elders, and those elders don't know what the researchers are doing, so they may say something that may trigger the researchers to write something in a certain way that becomes the truth, because this is the only things that as a written resource that we can have a hands on. So this is also the question that I would like to look into in the future to see, for example, when it comes to performing arts, singing, and how the dance performance has been documented, and by whom, and whose voice is it represented in the literature.
Yeah, on that note, there are a couple questions, but do you have some advice for how spaces like museums, classrooms, scholarship as well, but can better represent Ainu voices and share the actual histories of Ainu.
Yes, one things that I could think of for now is to, for example, to give opportunity for Ainu representative to speak about their own cultures, and of course, and also to make a different documentation aside what is already written, which is some museum have already done. You have a story written by majority, and then there is another story which sometimes is completely different, the storyline that is told or written by indigenous peoples. There one can compare how history has been written differently and perceived. So things like that I would like to see more in Japan and elsewhere. What do you think about that?
That sounds great. I guess this is more about the performance at the end of your presentation. Can you talk a bit more about how you came to create that dance and song, and doing it in your own way as opposed to a very strictly kind of historical traditional way?
Yes, I have been thinking for many, many years, and even when I was in Tokyo together with my Ainu friends, and because those performing art practice are often very strict, and as a youth that time, we are not really allowed to make changes. It was very important to follow the rules and do it properly for the audience, especially because we had performance that we are going to show to the audience who have paid for. So that was very important. But then I felt that it was not really me. I wanted to do experiment, explore a new possibility of expression, which was not allowed. Nobody said it was not allowed, but everybody knew that that was not allowed. So then as I grow as indigenous scholars and understanding the history and this dynamic of complexity of identity and authenticity, I thought perhaps I could try something slightly different. So the dance steps are still the same as traditional dance step, but then I pick up some of the steps and put it together. And the first handstands is to show the struggle of one's identity. So sometimes, like everybody, it doesn't have to be indigenous, but sometimes we feel we want to hide from the world. And then sometimes you want to come a little bit, but maybe even a little bit more, and so forth. And then I did a tattoo that is inspired by Karafto Ainu. And those tattoos are believed to be a protection from the sickness and but diseases. The same with the traditional pattern of those this way. Here, these are protection from those sickness and illness, bad spirits as well. And so I saw that somebody also asked what kind of instrument. So the basic of the rhythm is this clapping. Is a basic rhythm that we have in Ainu dance. That was a basic, and then that is and also pentatonic scale that's used in the also native music. This, I mean, almost more or less saying what my musician friend is saying, because I don't know anything about music. And then that is as a backbone, and then they used he used the flute that was used in the Asia. And then kola, which is from the West Africa, that sounds a little bit similar to tonkodi instrument, that is our Ainu instrument from Karafto. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, that was great. Let's try to look at some. Yeah, okay. Do you, you mentioned with the student group that there is Wajin and Ainu, and there is some connections there, but also differences. How do you see Ainu experience and Wajin life experience as well? How do you see them connecting in broader Japan society, or maybe being very different?
That was a difficult question. No, but the process that they're going through is more or less, I think, the same. They are finding themselves through this transformation journey of learning. Even for Ainu students, it doesn't mean that they know Ainu culture and language before. Some students come without no knowledge whatsoever. So then they meet completely new culture that's supposed to be part of you, but never knew about it, and then learn together with Japanese Wajin students. And the Wajin students also go through the same process. So process is the same, but then at some point, this collectivism, like doing same, going through all the processes and learning from each other and spending lots of time become like a really powerful inspiration for both of them, both students. So that kind of gives a hope for their future, and they have different dreams. And a lot of them say that even after they graduate from this university and this club, they want to continue to disseminate and tell their experience and story to the public. So that itself is success, I think, that just to plant the inspiration and the dream into the younger generation, I think that's a fantastic.
Can you tell us a bit more about one, other places like the restaurant that maybe exist in Tokyo or elsewhere, and two is what role do you see them playing in Ainu experience? And like you said, you learned some traditional things through them. So how do you see that being a resource for other Ainu folks?
How can that be used as a resource for other Ainu?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is those urban has a significant role in the cities. And I consider that place as my home, where I can always return to and go to, even though I'm not going to eat anything. I'm always welcomed. And that kind of safe place to go to was very important for me as a university student. And even to have that space for anybody, to Japanese or customers, is very important, so that everybody can experience the worldview of Ainu and food through the food culture. Through the food culture, there's lots of traditional knowledge embedded into the food. So we get to talk about that, and there you come closer. So more you promote Ainu culture gets better.
Thank you. Let's see. I guess another one is, I think we talked about this the other day, but it's also kind of a question here, is do you, what makes, I guess, like an Ainu person to the Ainu community, but also do you see issues of maybe people not meaningfully engaging with Ainu culture?
Meaningfully, what do you mean by meaningfully engaged in the Ainu culture?
I guess respectfully engaging with
yeah
Ainu
yeah
culture.
I mean it happens everywhere to any culture, I think, and it's also depending on to what context, to which degree. And so I definitely see that in the Ainu culture as well, and that's also because lack of information and lack of knowledge, so people may misunderstand the Ainu culture in completely different way than how we think of. And for example, I just see the one question that is all those instruments can be played by no one. And of course, if you can play that, then mukuri is very popular instrument. If you want to learn, you can go to those Ainu communities or museum. You can even purchase it. They can practice, and that's really wonderful that everybody's interested in it. What becomes a problem is that if you start taking it as it is your own instruments, you have to be transparent on what you are doing, where this comes from, and if this is modified version of your performance or music, or this, I think, very important, even for myself. Even though I'm recognized as a Ainu person, I have to make it clear that this is my version of Ainu culture, and this is my understanding, so it does not get confused or misunderstood.
Perfect. For younger generations of Ainu, what is something that you would, one teaching that you think is important for them to learn, and also what advice do you have to younger generations still figuring out how to learn?
Could you repeat what did you say first?
Yeah. Sorry. What is one teaching, traditional teaching, that you think is important for young Ainu to learn?
To be curious and follow your heart, I guess, to believe in yourself and explore the new possibilities. I think not to be afraid of new things, trying new things. I think it's a big difference between trying new things to go for something completely different, presenting as it is your own, for example. And as long as you are in dialogue with the people that you want to work with and trust and learn from, and then that's and also, as I also keep saying it, like to keep positive, and all my work, I focus on the positive side of Ainu culture and people. And there are lots written about Ainu language, for example, in history and archaeology and anthropology, especially physical anthropology, and so forth. And that is not my expertise. I'm more focusing on the contemporary side of Ainu people and culture that has never been told about before. I want to bring in Ainu voices, narratives, expressions, and so that there are, I'm not doing anything special than any other Japanese scholars who have done, because they have done exactly the same. It's just that we didn't have an Ainu scholar before. So to make a balance in the academy is important.
Yes, absolutely. I love seeing more Indigenous scholars talking about their culture and putting some really respectful narratives out there. I guess I feel like I've asked a lot of these questions, and you kind of just answered some of the other ones, that to look to some other resources, books and everything, as well as I know there's a question about musicians and artists, and I think your website has some of that information that I knew today with different creators. Is there any thing that I didn't ask or that people didn't ask that you would really like to share with everyone?
I think I have said pretty much, but I would actually like to Scott to contribute or share his experience with the website, how he sees the possibility into the future. And also just going back to what you said about this international connection, you know, the Ainu story and case is the very small example in the global scale, but like you say, you know, there's so much that we can share and recognize within. And that is something that we may learn from each other. So therefore, this kind of the seminar, it opens up a dialogue and more open space where each of us is respected is very important. So I hope this kind of event will be held more often so that everybody can join in the conversation. That's very important. And to come to that point, I hope I created this website where we don't have a chat system because we don't have such capacities and may not respond to all emails that comes to our website. But nevertheless, we created this platform where people can access to the contemporary livelihood Ainu and the literature and artists and advocacy. So I hope that is helpful. Scott, please.
Yeah, maybe I can say a few words on the website ainutoday.com. So we just launched it on June 16th. It's been up on the web for a little while before that, but it was just formally launched last Wednesday. So please do take a look. And as Dr. Zawa mentioned, she's the founder, and we're a support mechanism. And you can see the folks on the website. Some of them are participants today or attendees on the webinar today. But I think this is as I've told others that we've been working on the website with, this is it's a long-awaited, long-needed platform of the sorts. So as we discussed earlier today, and some of the questions we're hinting at, is that not all Japanese language literature makes it back to the community. A lot of research is done in English, not translated or not shared back into Japanese. But the reverse can also be said. There's a lot of things in resources in Japanese that just do not make it internationally. And English is, I guess, one platform for that. And in 2007 or 2008, I started my own website where I had a links page that still exists, but I put it together for my own reference because things online were constantly changing. And I had all these other ideas, but I also knew that it wasn't me that needed to do it. It needed to come to the community. So I kind of stopped myself in my tracks just with keeping things that would be useful for me or useful when people came along asking for web links and this and that. And I could point them in a different direction. So I think this website is serving a long-standing need and purpose for engagement, keeping and encouraging international dialogue on contemporary Ainu issues, what it means to be Ainu today. Like Dr. Uzawa said, keeping things positive, forward-looking, and the website is by no means a delegator of what is or what is not to be interpreted one way or another, but simply an added resource, I think, where you can see different scholarship and come reach out to people like Dr. Uzawa or other people in the Ainu arts community, which she highlights on the website.
I think I missed one question really quick. How do you see, I guess with a lot of stuff being written, and as you said is more kind of oral based, but how do you see the role of oral histories and stories? How does having everything written down maybe lose some of the cultural value that is in oral histories and stories?
That is so interesting question. That's true, isn't it? I think it does, because documentation makes it somehow definite, as that's how it looks like, at least. But then if it's an oral literature, it has all different range of the tone of the voice, how you tell the story, and so forth is passed on generation to generation, which is very important for family members and community members to listen into. So yeah, I haven't thought about it, but that's very interesting. Good point. Thank you.
I guess on that note, do you hope maybe more people will produce different types of, I guess, media, as opposed to just like kind of standard scholarship literature, but put more videos out there, audio recordings, performances, to really show Ainu culture and being especially contemporary Ainu culture?
Yeah, sure. But the point is that I think Ainu themselves should be a producer. We should decide, we all have to participate in the production phase and development phase. And as long as we have that, then I think it's fantastic. Because what happened often is that, you know, all the filmmakers comes and then I ask Ainu to be in it, but we don't have last say in the production. So that, of course, is highly problematic, and then it's not contributing to the community, because how it is produced is from the lens of non-Ainu person. So.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions. Thank you, Kanako, for answering them, and thank you everyone for asking the questions. It's really exciting to engage in more conversation. So thanks again. And Scott?
Thank you, Cheyenne, for leading us through that question and answer period. And thank you, Dr. Uzawa, for all the informative answers that you've provided. So I think we'll start to wrap up the session for today. So thank you for all the wonderful questions from the attendees. And if we didn't get to your question today, or if you have follow-up questions or comments, please do feel free to reach out to us directly. Once again, thank you, Dr. Uzawa, for taking the time. It's late in the evening for you, where you're located. So thank you for that, and entertaining all these questions from our attendees. Thank you, Cheyenne, for all your commentary and efforts in going through the questions as well. We also owe thanks to the David Lamb Center at Simon Fraser University, notably Doris and Professor Michael Hathaway, for making this session possible. This meeting was also made possible by SFU's, Simon Fraser University's meeting, events, and conference services. So thank you, Omar, Luke, and Amanda. And thank you to all the attendees that took time to join us today. So thank you. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day, and goodbye.